All right, so my name is Stacey Dixon. I'm the forester for Snohomish and Whidbey Island Conservation District. And today I'm just going to give you an overview of forests in the region. There were a lot of great questions that were submitted, and I probably will not be able to answer all of them, but hopefully we can at least touch on the subjects. So I actually work for both Whidbey Island and Snohomish Conservation District. I was hired as a cluster model, meaning my time is split between the conservation districts, and a bunch of other foresters in the region also have their time split. And that's just so conservation districts can have extra capacity for technical assistance to landowners, but not pay for the whole staff time. And so I support our work and lead our work regionally across the Puget Sound as well. So today I'm going to talk about Pacific Northwest forests and then Whidbey Island forests in particular. I'll talk about some common forest health issues I've seen on Whidbey Island, general guidelines for management, and lastly, we'll go over some resources for landowners, particularly if you have some of the forest health concerns that I talk about today on site. First, I want to express to you all that forests are more than just a collection of trees. There are a lot of different elements moving throughout the forest, the carbon cycle being one of them, trees taking in carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water and giving us oxygen. But there's also materials cycling through the rock cycle, nutrient cycling as leaves decay onto the forest, and then it's more than just the trees, right? There's wildlife. We have bears and cougars and bobcats and birds, and we live in the forest, and we're part of the forest and what happens to it. So we need to manage for all of those elements, not just the trees. So there's a bigger system at play here that I hope you all see today, and look past the trees to the wider ecosystem. First, forests are place-based. They are in the context of geographic elements. For us on Whidbey Island, it's particularly important to know about the orographic uplift effect, which is something that happens when clouds that are full of moisture move off of the Pacific Ocean. Generally, our wind direction goes towards the northeast off the Pacific Ocean. As clouds cool, they become less dense and moisture is released on the west side of mountains. And that means that on the east side of the mountains, there's drier conditions. So that's what creates the rain shadow, resulting in a little bit less precipitation for Whidbey Island. You can see this regionally impacting our ecology throughout Washington state. So here in this diagram, it shows the prevailing wind direction going in the northeast direction off the Pacific Ocean. All of these colors at the bottom represent precipitation. The color that's most dominant in the map is green, which is more precipitation than blue. So you can see that as the clouds move, they start to drop more and more moisture like a rag being squeezed out. And then on the backside of those mountains, on the east side, it becomes drier. And you can see the result here of less precipitation. And on a bigger scale, the eastern Washington area is particularly less wet and way more dry, resulting in completely different forest types and species conditions. So we can't just implement east side Washington forest management in our west side forests. The small caveat to that is Whidbey Island being in a rain shadow might have some similarities to the east side drier conditions in some ways, more so than just mainland Washington, Western Cascades. This is a graph of Pacific Northwest annual temperatures and trends over time, created by the Climate Impacts Group at University of Washington, which has a lot of resources on climate change if you're interested. Forest management needs to be in the context of larger climate trends. This graph I put on this presentation to show you that our annual temperature is very variable. And as you all know, we've had a pretty mild spring. And if you were just to look at our spring, you might think the climate's not warming, but it's important to take in the larger view. So if you look at this graph from 1920 to 2010, there is a general trend of increased temperatures over time. But if you take a different combination of years, such as 2003 to 2010, you'll see a decrease in temperature. So all of this to say is that there's an incredible amount of variability in our climate trends, and it's important to manage for that. The Climate Impacts Group also has identified that we are going to be seeing more dramatic change in temperature in about 30 years, and we'll have pretty similar temperature up until that point. So as we manage for forests, not only do we have to manage for the next 30 years, which is more similar to what we've been experiencing, but then also what happens in 30 years. Those trees are going to still be alive. Our trees live longer than 30 years, right? So we have to manage for both the present, near future, and long term. Forests are dynamic. They grow and change over time. So management will not be the same in 10 years if you're doing a particular prescription on your land today. And there's a general trajectory of how forests develop. So this is one schematic from Brown academic paper regarding the transition from grass forbs all the way to closed canopy and old growth conditions. We do kind of know what this trajectory looks like in Pacific Northwest forests and when we might see some of these changes, which we'll talk more about today. But really, this slide is just to tell you, forests change, they grow up, they get older, and our management also must be tailored to that change. I know many of you on this call are very familiar with our species in Pacific Northwest, but I want to give a quick overview of some of them. So Douglas fir, our main timber species, has a bottle brush needle layout on the branches. They are early successional species, and I'll go over that term, but they like sunlight and more open environments when they're first planted. They grow very quickly in the Pacific Northwest, which makes them a really high value lumber species. They're a little bit more drought tolerant than other species. Any other thoughts? If anybody has anything else they want to share about Douglas fir, you can just put it in the chat, maybe some interesting anecdote or something like that. Western red cedar is the next species I want to highlight. It has these scale-like needles, so very different needles than Douglas fir. It's more shade tolerant, and it often has a big buttress at the bottom, so really elongates at the base. Western red cedar can live a very long time, about 1,000 years. And interesting fact about all of these species on this slide, they've only been in the Pacific Northwest for about 15,000 years. So when you think about the Western red cedar lifespan being 1,000 years, there's only been, let's say, maybe 15 to 20 different generations of Western red cedar on this land. And so not that much time for this species to adapt. Western hemlock, all the way to the right, has shorter needles than Douglas fir, but also a little bottle brushy, so it can be a little confusing. It has smaller cones, so that might be a distinguishing factor. And a lot more delicate. But the real determining thing is this witch's hat at the top that flops over. Oftentimes you can identify Western hemlock through that. Western hemlock is also very shade tolerant, can grow in the understory. Next couple species I want to mention are hardwood species, very often on Whidbey Island. Red alder, a early successional species, so coming in also in open environments, very dense. It seeds in. You usually don't have to plant alder. Usually the seeds can travel very far and it will just regenerate naturally, growing in the forest naturally. Alder is a nitrogen fixing plant, so it does a lot for soil development and health. And it usually only grows in sunlight, so it doesn't grow under itself normally. Normally there's an understory of rich vegetation under it because of the deciduous leaves let in a lot more light, and so there can often be rich understory under the alder. Big leaf maple is a very important tree in our forests. The leaves decay into the soil and add calcium, so an important soil development species as well. Big leaf maple can be tapped for maple syrup. It has a lot less sugar content than the eastern sugar maple, and it grows vigorously. So great in shade and sun, so pretty agile plant for that reason. Generally grows on gravel or alluvial outwash, so areas that had been, how do I explain alluvial outwash? Areas that like have had big rushing rivers and have had a lot of gravel deposited. Before I move on, I'm sure I've already said a lot of jargon, but I do want to stop myself and define a couple that I know I will say. So forest stands are management units. So you can see the photo on the left is an aerial photo of a forest that's been delineated based off of conditions. So those are different management units, also known as stands. And oftentimes it can be determined by species or perhaps the geography or site conditions or history. Perhaps one area has been harvested and one area has not. And those would determine stands in your forest. So it's just really like a way to talk about a part of your forest. The other term I want to define is diameter at standard height. People also call it breast height. And that is 4.5 feet off the ground. So that's just where we measure trees, and it's standardized so we can compare apples to apples. So as I mentioned before, forests grow and change over time. And there has been a lot of work to understand that growth process and to define it more clearly so that we know when we're doing management where we're applying our treatments in the stand history and the trajectory of that forest. So for conifers in the Pacific Northwest, we often see this stand initiation stage where we have lots of young trees growing up in an open environment. Then they start to compete for sunlight and nutrients. And through that process, they don't let any light to the understory. They don't let any light to the forest floor. And their crowns, their tree canopies start to touch and compete. This is a really long and dark process. And then next is the understory reinitiation stage, which happens when the trees start to compete so much that they break open and some die and sunlight is let into the forest floor and new seedlings come up. So this is a breaking down of the main cohort and new trees come in with a second cohort. The escalation of that over time is old growth conditions where certain trees become very dominant and there's a whole suite of trees in the understory and mid canopy that are growing as well, with lots of coarse woody debris on the ground, so lots of logs on the ground. So we'll go through that a little bit slower with some photos. So here's the stand initiation stage. You can see the Douglas fir coming up in the open area. Douglas fir needs a lot of sunlight, so this is perfect conditions for it. And just take a moment to look at all of the understory species that are on this photo. So I can see that there's some rushes, so some sedges, I see some foxtail, I see probably some alder, definitely huckleberry, I do see some invasive species, but just all the different variations in color, we can count probably about 20 species easily. So this is actually the most diverse stage in a forest life, which sometimes surprises people because a lot of folks think that old growth forest is the pinnacle of forest health. But in fact, we actually have a lack of this early seral stand initiation phase in Washington. So much so that the US Forest Service is harvesting trees and just letting meadows form so that we can get this particular landscape back. So once all those Douglas fir trees grow up, I know it's kind of a quick fast forward, But then they start to compete and we get the stem exclusion stage. So this is a Douglas, actually I think this is noble fir. This is a conifer forest that has competed so much that all the branches below no longer get sunlight and have died. This is really typical for Whidbey Island, to have very dense forests like this. And just to compare, how many understory species do we see here? Looks like there's maybe a ground cover in the foreground of this photo, definitely some grass in the back, but nothing else compared with this. So the diversity of this stage of the forest is really low. It's characterized by dark, dense conditions without a lot of light coming through. If there's not a lot of woody material on the ground, oftentimes it can have really low wildlife value. And the trees are stressed. When trees are competing for sunlight like this, they go up in height, not diameter, and they have reduced capacity to defend themselves against forest health issues like bugs, insects, or disease. This stage can go on for a very long time without intervention. It takes a really long time for the trees to get tall enough to fall over, and then for new trees to come into that new sunlight. But once that does happen, we get this understory reinitiation stage. And you can see that there's western hemlock growing in the understory here. So in the shade, it's capitalized on that new sunlight and it's growing under some Douglas fir and grand fir. We see a little bit more understory here. I see some sword fern and some salmonberry, but still not as diverse as that first slide. This usually has pretty high rates of growth. The trees are growing quite fast and putting on a lot of carbon. So this would be a carbon dense forest, but there might be some other forest health issues as the trees compete enough to die. Something else. Usually this is a really high transpiration rate. So trees are photosynthesizing a lot, but they're also transpiring a lot. So it's a high use of water. And lastly, if you fast forward all of that, you get old growth forest. Big trees taking up the dominant canopy, lots of understory diversity, lots of seedlings that are smaller growing up, and lots of biomass on the ground. So you can see like a log here to the left of the trail. So there's a lot going on with this forest. And this also has high ecological diversity as well and value. All of this really is determined by disturbance. And I know we have some forestry experts in the crowd, so can somebody put in the chat what is a disturbance in forestry? And if you don't know, you can think to yourself and see. All right, Dave says wildfire. Okay, not sure if any of my other forestry experts are going to weigh in. It's a physical and biological force that shapes and changes the forest ecosystem. So wildfire is an example of disturbance, as well as, awesome, I see man, right? So logging is a form of disturbance. There's a photo of a landslide here, very large landslide. Wind, where a bunch of trees get knocked over all at once. It's called wind throw. And this is emerald ash borer. So emerald ash borer is an insect that affects Oregon ash, and it actually just reached Oregon. So all of our forest development is driven by disturbance and will be impacted by disturbance, especially the type of disturbance and the legacy that each type of disturbance leaves. So here's that same successional pathway. I don't know if I define succession. Succession is just the growth of forests over time. So just what we're looking at is how trees and forests grow, and that is a succession. So I will say early seral, which refers to this young stage. or late seral, which is this stage. So this is a similar graphic, but it's a little less timber focused and more disturbance focused. So this timeline was defined by a fire, which left large snags standing. These snags could have become habitat for a pileated woodpecker or other birds. And they left some spaces where young trees could grow up. And these snags stay on site all the way to mature forests. So these are called legacy features that are passed from one stand cohort to the next. And so this forest is going to grow up with these legacy features and it's impacted by the fire. Perhaps there was additional carbon added to the soil from the fire, which will affect growth, as well as a species change. With a big fire, there's lots of sunlight, so maybe it was a perfect situation for Douglas fir or alder. Or more dramatically, if you go on the east side and there's a big fire, lodgepole pine will come in very, very dense and close together. So that's a species that has adapted with fire over time. If we look at a few other disturbance events, we can see how the forest trajectory may change. So this is a graphic of wind throw. So a bunch of trees being thrown over in one direction by a big gust of wind. You can see the upturned roots. So this is an example of a legacy feature that will perhaps impact growth. So if there's a lot of material, it might result in a beetle outbreak that will affect the next stand, and so on and so on. With this diagram down below, this is a forest that's been harvested, so all of the woody material has been taken off site. So that might affect the soil nutrient level as well. And oftentimes with harvesting, we see planting often at 10-foot spacing. So that's a really dense planting, and it could be that we only see timber species planted, which will then affect the growth of the forest. So I'm just trying to get you to think about how we as individuals change our forests, how disturbances change our forests, and how that will affect how the forest grows, and therefore should affect how we manage that forest. All of our species have evolved over time to be in conjunction with these disturbance events. Our forests have developed in partnership with disturbance. So Douglas fir is really well developed for open sunlight conditions. So it would grow after a big wind throw event where lots of sunlight came in. It would grow after a very big fire. It also grows well after clear cut. So that is often why we clear cut in the Pacific Northwest. It's not because everybody hates trees, but it's because the main timber species, Douglas fir, really likes a lot of sunlight. The same reason, on the counter side, it is very shade intolerant. So it does not like to be in the shade. So when it's competing so much for sunlight, it gets so tall and it will often just fall over if it gets too tall and too skinny. And this is a result of its sunlight, its ability to grow in shade. So this forest needs to be thinned. And we may talk a little bit more about that. Next, we can think about how alder may have it developed with different disturbances. So red alder, because it's early successional, early forest development, it's done really well it grows really well when there's big open light environments, just like Douglas fir. And it's a riparian species, meaning it likes to grow by the rivers and in wet areas. So it's evolved over time to be able to capitalize off of freshly deposited soil or gravel material near rivers. And then it will grow up very dense. And because it needs all of that sunlight, it won't grow under itself. So usually after an alder forest dies, it becomes generally understory dominated, so shrub dominated. Western red cedar, as I mentioned earlier, is shade tolerant, so it can grow under other species. It makes a trade-off to keep growing in those shade conditions with water retention. So trees have different levers that they can pull in their needles. It's called the stomata, the gas exchange, and they can make decisions based off of how much they want to grow versus how much water they want to save. So certain species do better in drought conditions because they're judicial about opening their stomatas for growth and not releasing a bunch of water. Western red cedar is just kind of a constant grower, so it's not going to be as great under drought conditions or new sunlight conditions. In that way, it's particularly susceptible to thinning shock, meaning if you were to remove trees around it, it will show some signs of stress. So this forest, you can see that there's a stump in the middle of these two trees. This forest was thinned, so these cedars probably had more shade at one point, and then this tree was removed, and maybe this tree was removed, and now it's showing some thinning shock. And this is all because of the strategy that Western red cedar has developed over time. It's developed to be a good shade-tolerant species that can grow in the understory. As I mentioned earlier, Western hemlock is very shade tolerant, also can grow in the understory. It likes to grow in these thin soils that develop on stumps, which is pretty cool. And oftentimes it will grow up in the understory all the way till it can be a dominant tree. And so then when Douglas fir dies, Western hemlock is ready to go and take that space. So it's a late successional species. It usually comes in after Douglas fir. Big leaf maple has developed some really interesting strategies. It can grow in both sunlight and shade, but in particular, it can grow from its base. So you can cut it down and it can re-sprout over time. So it has developed to be pretty versatile. It can handle riparian areas that perhaps see a lot of stream migration and movement of material, and it can grow in those, or it can grow in pretty dense forest as well. Takes up a lot of canopy space. So those are just an overview of the species we have on site and some of their characteristics and how they work together and compete. And management is a tool that we have to intervene in the normal process of the forest and reach certain objectives. Particularly, oftentimes, people have objectives to create old growth conditions. Management is a tool, forest management can be a tool to accelerate that successional pathway I've been showing you from young forest to old forest. You can do something called a variable density thin that breaks up the normal stand conditions of just plantation rows and creates variability in space that's more similar to an old growth forest. So in this aerial view, this one outlined in red is a gap treatment with small harvests. This one is a control with no harvest at all. This one is a light thin, so you can see the ground coming through. And the green is a heavy thin with the ground coming through. A variable density thin treatment would mix all of these together in a mosaic structure to create more variability in space. And you could see how this to the right, this diagram to the right, is more similar to old growth with patchy sunlight coming in and perhaps space for understory species than a plantation structure. So without management, our forest would eventually get to old growth conditions, but management is a tool that we can use to speed that process up. So with all that, my hope is that you can see that we need to incorporate sun, wind, and water conditions in our management. So we need to know where we are in space. You need to know your species, because each species has different requirements for sunlight and other needs. And you can take into consideration time since disturbance. So if a forest is 20 years old, it's going to look and act a lot differently than a forest that's 200 years old. And lastly, depending on your objective, you can manage your forests differently. So now I'm just going to dive into Whidbey Island forests in particular and some things I've seen on Whidbey Island pretty consistently. So like I mentioned earlier, generally forests on Whidbey Island have trees that are very close together. There's a lot of reasons for this. There is a timber harvest history on Whidbey Island, and so a lot of parcels have been cut and planted very densely with Douglas fir, which is a timber species. Timber species like Douglas fir need to be thinned periodically, and oftentimes landowners buy property and they don't realize it's been planted, and they don't realize that there's an expectation for management with that planting density. So just a quick rule, if you can think about your forest or think about your couple trees in your yard, this is a rule for plantation forestry where there's lots of Douglas fir in one area. So if you have a lot of sunlight around your trees, it's not going to be as applicable. But you take the diameter of the tree and you add a constant of 5. So you just add 5. And this number gives you the distance between trunks of the tree. So it's just a quick way to identify whether your trees are a little too close together. So just to go over it a little bit more, if your diameter is 12 inches, you just bring it straight into feet, 12 feet, and then you just add 5 feet to get an average spacing between trees of 17 feet. So the goal with that would be to have 17-foot spacing if your trees were around 12 inches in diameter. And this is just trunk to trunk. Another way you can think about this is live crown ratio. So this is my only math for this presentation, so just hold on for just a little bit longer. The live crown ratio is just the percentage of the tree that has live green foliage. And you don't need to do all this calculation, you can just eyeball it. So the percentage of the tree that has living green foliage. So this one is about 30%. And that's actually the indicator mark of whether a tree is stressed. The needles on the tree are how the tree can photosynthesize and take in carbon dioxide and defend itself against all sorts of insects and disease. So when that crown is stressed, when that crown is small, the tree is therefore stressed. So your trees, as they're competing, will have their crowns recede over time as the branches down below don't get sunlight. So if crowns are 30% or less, that's also an indicator that you need to thin your forest. There is root rot on Whidbey Island. Oftentimes we'll see laminated root rot, which is just a type of root rot that affects Douglas fir. Root rot can be identified because usually wind throw will throw all the trees in one direction, but root rot often results in more of a jigsaw pattern on the ground with trees falling in different directions and roots being decayed all the way up to the base. So this root system that's upturned has really small roots, and if we were to go and look at it, I bet the wood would be a little spongy and not very firm. Management of root rot is to just transition away from susceptible species. So Douglas fir is susceptible, but western red cedar or big leaf maple or alder are not. It's a disease of the site. So if there's any woody material on site, the fungus will just keep eating that woody material. So unless you were to remove all of your pieces of wood, it just stays on site. So it's not managed, it's not effective to try to clear it out. You just transition away. So it's a long process. There are a lot of invasive species on Whidbey Island. So here's just to highlight a few. There's English ivy, which can just be hand pulled and put into the understory in the shade. You can use herbicide on it, but I find hand pulling to just be a great method. If it's climbing up your trees, you definitely want to remove it and create a big block in between the pieces of ivy. So create a break in the ivy, a 2-foot break usually. You can just saw it off and make that cut. The other species here in the center is tansy ragwort, which is very harmful to animals. So it's a very invasive and bad plant for pasture land. and it has very long-lived seeds and prolific seeds. So if you see this in your property, you can cut off the heads of the flowers before they go to seed and put them in the garbage and just hand pull the plants out. Lastly, to the right, there's Scotch broom, which I often see on roadsides on Whidbey or recently cut areas. For more information, well, I guess Scotch broom you can hand pull as well. I really like using a weed wrench with Scotch broom. So there's a tool that you can like attach to the bottom of the plant and you lean back with your weight and that pops it out of the ground. You can leave Scotch broom in the shade as well, but if it has seeds on it, you might want to dispose of those seeds with a trash bag and put them in the garbage. For more information on these species as well as any others, you can go to kingcounty.gov. They have amazing full management guides for each species. And if you need a link for that, feel free to email me and I can send it to you. I do get a lot of calls about hemlock woolly dalgid, which is an aphid that has it secretes these white puffs on the hemlock. And it's not a problem in Western Washington. Oh, thanks for the weed wrench note. It's not a problem in Western Washington. It has been a problem with eastern hemlock in the eastern US. So that can sound some alarms for people if they're moving from the East Coast to here, but it has not been a huge killer of our trees. It's slightly associated with more developed areas, so it's not going to be in a really dense natural forest without a lot of development around. It can kill trees, but it would have to take over the whole crown. So then again, you would be looking at the live crown ratio. And if it was 30% or more, you're probably in the clear. There are some management tools for it, like you can spray it off the tree, but I would not suggest that. I would just leave it. Bark beetles and other beetles are not a big issue in Western Washington. I haven't seen that come up. So I do get a couple calls just about insect infestation on the trees. It's just not a big deal in Whidbey Island. So unless it's really killing a lot of your needles or a lot of your trees, I wouldn't worry about it. Okay, one thing I see, especially as development increases in Island County, is compaction. Oftentimes I'll get called out to a site after a house has been put on a property, and unfortunately they didn't realize that compaction was a big issue and their trees are suffering. So compaction is not reversible. It's long-term damage to the tree. And this diagram shows how roots actually go out about the extent of the canopy, if not longer. So when you're doing a construction project, you really want to create a tree protection zone where no equipment can go over the tree roots, nothing can get piled there, no woody material. And if you can, I would make it 1.5 times the canopy. Ideally, if you have driveways that go next to high value trees, that driveway ideally moves, or perhaps you can create a layer of mulch. So 2 to 3 inch pile of mulch around the tree can help aerate the soil by just adding in microorganisms. Mindy, your note about bark beetles is super interesting. Have you had someone come out to your property and see that there's bark beetles? I have not heard of any major outbreaks on Whidbey Island with bark beetles. So let's see, maybe if you have like a photo of the canals that it makes. Okay, so it's really normal for bark beetles to be in trees after they die. So if you have trees that are dying for some other reason, like if you have some old alder, there's definitely going to be beetles in there. They just won't kill a tree generally for Whidbey Island. There's not usually very large trees. So your trees could be dying for other reasons. Generally, there's this thing called a tree mortality spiral where it's really hard to see what kills a tree. So it could be a whole combination of things, but usually when trees are stressed, they're going to be more susceptible to beetles. So it probably wasn't the beetles that killed the trees, but yeah, hard to say. So another big factor on Whidbey Island, because it's just drier forest conditions, you do want to protect your home from fire. And you really want to focus on the 100 feet around the home. There's a lot of really narrow driveways and tucked back areas on Whidbey. So as much as you can, creating a turnaround for emergency services, that's going to be super helpful. This is a graphic of a bunch of things that you can do around the home, such as removing fire material, flammable material from up right next to the home that could catch the home on fire. You definitely want to clean off your roof and any debris that falls on your home over the winter and spring. And then as you go out to that 70-foot to 100-foot area around the home, you can reduce the canopy of your forest, so making the trees canopy not touch. So that would be a thin. After 100 feet, I don't have any forest management recommendations for fire risk reduction. And that's because Western Washington forests are just so vigorous that if you were to do like a big fire break, you would have to control that fire break really regularly in order to keep the flammable material down. And it's just not normally worth your time. And it changes the characteristics of our forests. We have wet, vigorous forests in Western Washington. So to try to make it fire proof would change the function of the forest. But in this 100-foot zone around the home, fire risk reduction is highly encouraged. Oftentimes, Whidbey Island residents do have grass around their forests and not a lot of dead wood material. This dead wood is incredibly important for soil development. And I do recommend as much as possible removing lawn and allowing for this soil buildup process to occur through having understory shrubs, deciduous shrubs, and down wood. And even if you have a lawn and you want to keep that lawn, perhaps adding large logs here or there, like if a tree falls on your property, just leaving it. It's highly recommended. You can see that there's cavities in these logs for small mammals and other birds to go in and use it. So there's a lot of benefit from having these on your property. The one caveat is that you don't want to have this within that 100-foot fire protection zone. So this would be out in your forest. There were a lot of questions about dying trees as folks registered for this webinar. Unfortunately, most likely, a lot of the reason for this is because of drought. This is a photo of Western red cedar showing some drought dieback. This dieback from the top down happens because the tree no longer has access to water at its roots. The xylem brings water up from the ground all the way to the top of the tree. And when there's not enough water, there becomes a cavitation in that xylem. So basically the cohesion bond between the water molecules breaks and the tree just gives up on its top half. So we're seeing this with Western red cedar all around the Pacific Northwest. And it could mean that Western red cedar in the future is a tree that grows better in wet areas primarily, and not so much in dry areas. We are also seeing a lot of dieback with Western hemlock. Western hemlock has shallow root systems, and it will sometimes die from the bottom up. So I did see a few folks who registered talking about that as well. If you have a Western red cedar tree on your property that's dying, I encourage you to take a photo and post it to the Forest Health Watch, which is an organization that is documenting and tracking the dieback around the Pacific Northwest, so that we know where it's worse and which areas are doing okay. Okay, I'm really taking my time here, so I guess I'm going to move a little bit faster. I'm going to talk a little bit more about management. You can manage your forest for wildlife by having lots of snags. So ideally you have around 2 to 4 snags per acre. Snags are just standing dead trees. You want them to be larger in diameter, at least 10 inches in diameter, and 8 to 15 feet tall. So if you do have a lot of dead trees on your property, I encourage you to keep them either standing with at just 8 to 15 feet tall. That way the weight of the canopy is not dragging the tree down and it's a little bit less of a safety hazard. Or you can leave them on the ground as coarse woody debris. You can also install nest boxes or create little frog ponds. There's all sorts of great wildlife management that you can do. And if you're very interested in this, I encourage you to contact Ken Bevis, who does individual tours for folks and gives folks gives folks recommendations on wildlife management. You can think about creating heterogeneity in your forest, like creating that old growth structure by having big trees and small trees and openings and gaps. And this creates lots of edges where shade and sunlight meet, which is very great for wildlife. It also means that different age trees might be more resilient to certain disturbances. So like if an insect pathogen came through or an insect outbreak, young trees might be more defensible than older trees. Especially wind, young trees can really tolerate wind disturbance a lot more than older trees. So just having that mix is really valuable. I'm gonna skip this one. All right, so Dave Peterson is a great scholar in our area, and he's created this list of items for climate resilience. So these are just some management tools that you can keep in your head as you manage your forest. So first, just keeping forests as forest land is so valuable for so many reasons in Washington State. You can reduce non-climate stressors such as invasive species. Ensure successful regeneration, meaning you can ensure that your little seedlings grow up into trees, either by caging them or tubing them, protecting them from browse. Plant drought-tolerant species like western white pine or oak would be good options for Whidbey Island. Manage stand density. So the more the trees are closer together, the more they're going to be competing for moisture. So thinning is a really valuable tool for increasing moisture on site. You can diversify your forest structure, which we've talked about quite a bit. Implement fire-safe practices and manage for carbon uptake and sequestration. So on that note, younger trees uptake carbon at a faster rate, but older trees store more carbon. So having a mix of young trees and old trees is best for carbon management. Just a few resources for you all with this information. There are a couple programs for forest landowners on Whidbey Island. There's the Designated Forest Land Taxation Program, which is a timber program that encourages timber management, so through harvest, and you defer your taxes annually and then pay a percentage fee when you sell your timber. You do need a management plan for this, and the assessor takes applications annually. The Public Benefit Rating System is a tax program that gives you a tax break for holding important resources for the public. So just the fact that you have forest land is a benefit to the public, and you can get a tax break for that. That being said, it's scaled based off of how many important resources you have on site. So it's a point-based system. If you have more valuable resources like streams or wetlands, in addition to large amounts of forested acreage, you could have a greater reduction in your taxes. The public benefit rating system is being revamped right now. We're hoping that we will see some new county rules and tax code. Sorry, my dog. Some new rules and tax code on the public benefit rating system within the next year or so. And having a management plan will get you additional points that will result in lower taxes. So I highly encourage you to write a management plan. And you might be thinking, I don't know what that is. I don't know how to do that. But we do have partners at WSU Extension, and they have this awesome class called the Coached Planning class. And it teaches you how to write your own management plan, with each week being a different part of the plan. So they do a week on streams, they do a week on wildlife, and you get a visit from a forester at the end of that program. Sometimes I do them. In the future, it will probably be a DNR forester that will give you site assessment information. If you have a forest that looks like this in the photo, bunch of young trees, so this would be the stand initiation stage going into the stem exclusion stage, you can have some help from state and federal agencies to help you pay for the cost of thinning this forest. The USDA has a program called EQIP or EQIP, and it can help share the cost of managing that thinning for this forest. The Department of Natural Resources has new forest health money that has funding for a variety of practices, including thinning. And so really, if you have any natural resource issues on site, like invasive species that are choking out your trees, or you have a culvert that's too small and fish couldn't get up it, all of those issues, there could potentially be some cost share funding for you. Okay, I wanted to get to questions, so I was racing through the end, but now I can take questions.
So just really quickly, I'm gonna launch the poll just so we have captive folks, and it'll just take a few minutes. But I did also want to read a question to Stacey that popped up as a direct message to me from Maggie. It was, when, if ever, is it a good time to manually thin a stand of trees in a stem competing stage?
Yeah, so if you have this young Douglas fir forest or other conifer forests that are really close together, you might want to thin them. You can use that diameter plus 5 rule to assess whether your trees are too close together. So if you take the diameter and just add 5, and in diameter, you can maybe just like hold out your hand or get a piece of paper that's 12 inches long and kind of see if you don't have any tools for that. And then I'd also look at the live crown ratio just to see if the live crown ratio is going below 30%. That could be an indicator that you need to thin that forest. There's another thing I did not talk about, which is the height to diameter ratio. So if the trees get really tall and really thin, they could fall over. And if your forest is full of really tall, really thin trees, you want to be very careful about thinning, because they're going to be more susceptible to wind after a thin. So there's some different tactics for dealing with that. But I would look at that live crown ratio and see if it's under 30. Hopefully that helps. Can a wetland area at the edge of the forest be designated as protected? Are you talking about like for conservation easements? So usually the Whidbey Island Land Trust or Highland County Land Trust, the Land Trust is generally interested in parcels that are about 20 acres or more. If you have a really high value wetland, like a fish stream that runs into the wetland, so it's a fish wetland, they could be interested in that type of conservation, but usually they want to protect larger lands. The designated forest land taxation program does kind of act as an easement, because if you were to leave that program and want to develop the property, you would have to pay back taxes, 7 years of back taxes on all the money that was saved. And you can put forested wetland areas into that program as well. There's not a lot of other conservation options for folks on Whidbey Island, especially folks with smaller land smaller parcels. That being said, there's a lot of restrictions on what you can do with forests around a wetland. So the Department of Natural Resources regulates any wetland harvesting with very strictly, as well as Island County critical areas. So it is somewhat protected just by those rules. Yeah. Okay, what's the best strategy for, oh, got a couple in here. What advice do you give to landowners who have a lot of dense young red alder? Red alder has a really short thinning window. So by that, I mean there's only a certain amount of time in the forest development process of red alder that you can make an entry and thin that forest and have the forest respond with better growth and better health. Douglas fir has a much longer thinning window. So you might be able to thin from age 10 to age 60 or 70. Red alder really only responds to thinning when it's between age 5 and age 20. So if the young red alder is in that demographic, you can thin it so that there's about 12-foot spacing between the trees, and then they'll grow really nice and tall and have a good life. If they're beyond that point, there's fewer options, and it will probably just stay a dense young red alder forest. Really, most of the time I say to leave it, or maybe do a gap treatment where I take out the alder and put some conifers in that new open space that will be a little bit more long-lived and just add that species diversity on site. Yeah, it's a tricky one if you're too late. What's the best management strategy for struggling Scowler willow stands? Ooh. I wonder if they're struggling because they don't have water. Do you know why they're struggling? I'm not familiar with that species. Too much wind. So often we can create windbreaks with trees. So they will often be done around agricultural areas. So having those young flexible trees is really important. So if wind is affecting the willow, I wonder if you could plant a line of young trees next to it. So like shore pine might be appropriate there to help reduce the wind impact. And with that, you kind of want to create a ramp for the wind. So you go up in height so that the wind goes over your trees and over your forest. Do you have recommendations for a firewood farm? Yeah, so that's really interesting. I've never heard of that before, but I guess my recommendations would be to choose species that can be coppiced. So firewood material does not have to be, great timber. So you could coppice maple or oak, maybe even growing red alder would be a good option. And by that, I mean, you can cut off the limbs of those species and they will just regenerate from the base. Yeah.
Did you see the question about providing a template for a plan to reduce taxes?
Definitely. We have templates available. I wonder if we should make those available on our website, Allison.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Yeah, that might be a good way to do it. And usually with folks, I just ask that they write in a few sentences with each section. And I can help work with you as far as finishing that plan too.